6th chapter of the Gospel of John, there's a story involving Jesus, the disciples, the Sea of Galilee, and a storm. It's a familiar story, and sometimes familiar makes it easy to miss small but important details. It begins with another story that you'll find in the Gospels: Jesus' miraculous provision of food for thousands of people. After feeding off the thousands, Jesus and his disciples, they separate. Jesus goes up to a mountain to pray, and the disciples wait around until the evening time. In the evening time, they get on a boat and they enter into a sea. After rowing for hours, for about 3 to 4 miles, a terrible storm descends on the sea and catches the disciple. You see, the Sea of Galilee is like a lake, but it is so large it is called a sea. It is about 13 miles long and at its widest point about 7.5 miles. Mark and Matthew both record storm happenings separate from his miracle of walking on the water. There's a reason why when we are caught in life by something unaware that is challenging or painful, we will like to compare it to a storm. These storms of life aren't always something that someone should have known was coming or have been prepared for. When that happens, how do you respond? Often, we do what the disciples did. We soldier on. I can't imagine how exhausted they must have been as they struggled to row and row through the storm with the violent waves and the strong winds. Of course, there's nothing wrong with giving our effort into making it through the storm. But this story reminds us that the most important thing when you're going through a storm is to remember who is with you. Now let's be honest here. Jesus' behavior is a bit peculiar. The word in verse 19 for walking is peripateo. It doesn't describe the normal way of walking. Its primary meaning isn't for walking, but for living life. Jesus isn't depicted as walking straight to them. He isn't rushing to their rescue. The text doesn't say Jesus was on the mountain, saw that they were struggling in the storm, and came right to them. Instead, Jesus is depicted as kind of meandering his way across the Sea of Galilee. This means the disciples must have been going through the storm for miles and for some purpose, because God is aware of everything, and God saw them and eventually made his way to them. But he didn't do it right away. In John's account, the miracle isn't Jesus stilling the storm, but rather it is Jesus walking on water and joining them in the boat. There isn't a report of the storm ending. Instead, the story describes the disciples with Jesus making it through the storm and to the shore. When Jesus does show up, though, the disciples are afraid. The text describes what happens next. But Jesus said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." They were glad. When Jesus said, "It is I," it is a Greek word. And what he says is ego eimi. The literal translation would be "I am," which is kind of odd thing to say to someone afraid. I am. Don't be afraid. Unless, of course, the one saying it is God, and he's informing them that God is present with them in the storm. As you probably have heard by this point in the study, those two words, I am, they have a rich theological history, for they are a way that Jesus used to convey to others his divine status. In the Jewish biblical tradition, Moses, Joshua, Elijah, and Elisha, they all parted water at different times in Israel history, but none of them ever managed to walk on water. The only one who ever walked on water was God himself. We see this in Job chapter 9 verse 8. And here is Jesus walking on water and telling the disciples, I am. Do not be afraid. Later on, during his ministry, Jesus will say, I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. We find that in John chapter 10 verse 15. As the good shepherd, we know Jesus is watching over us. The disciples experienced that truth when Jesus walked on water. After joining them in the boat, the text doesn't say that the storm stopped. Instead, it states in verse 21 that immediately the boat was at the shore. they'd passed through the storm and made it to their destination. A point of application is that often things are much worse than we imagine, and God is closer than we thought. One thing that has always puzzled us about this story is that why the disciples left without Jesus. The text seemed to imply they waited for him until evening came, but then they got into a boat and started across the sea at night without Jesus. Why would you ever leave Jesus behind? Well, following Jesus is hard. We see this in the same chapter a little bit later. After a long teaching on who Jesus is and why he came, the response is heartbreaking. And then, after this, many of the disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. The story continues. So Jesus said to the 12, "Do you want to go away as well?" Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God." Perhaps Peter's words are born out of their recent experience. William Barclay puts it this way: when Christ is there, the storm becomes calm, the turmoil becomes peace. What cannot be done is done. The unbearable becomes bearable, and men pass their breaking point and do not break. When you find yourself in a storm, may you hear the voice of Jesus saying, "It is I. Do not be afraid. I am. Do not be afraid." And may your response be as joyful and hopeful as the disciples when they took Jesus into the boat. Are you ready today to invite Jesus onto your boat? My prayer is that you do.